Let's look at the topic for tonight. So we're looking at leadership, oppression, and how justice speaks into that. So the crown of thorns this evening.
We've got, as ever, some opening questions to get us going. So we're going to do these one at a time. So very simply, what do you think a leader looks like in these different spheres, different worlds, if you like? So what do you think a leader looks like in business? What do you think a leader looks like in politics? What do you think a leader looks like in the military? And what do you think a leader looks like in the church?
I find this an interesting question, just particularly that question, what do you think a leader looks like in the church? You can all probably imagine the number of times Jez and I are told, oh, you don't look like a vicar. You're not what I would expect in a church leader, in a church minister.
The best one of those is when I got stopped by the police and I was told, oh, I expected you to still be in your cassock. Bear in mind, I was on holiday in South Wales.
Holiday?
Well,
yeah.
Time off work in Wales.
I find this an interesting question because people don't, even the people we minister to, so, you don't look like what I would expect you
Matt's
to.
asking, is that a good leader or a bad one?
You tell us.
I think we're looking for what you would consider a good leader.
All right, we'll go for
the
good.
Characteristics of a good leader in these different areas. Yeah.
Yeah, so I suppose what would you expect to see?
Yeah, so if you were bringing to mind the best business leader you could think of, I mean, mine would obviously be Michael Scott from The Office.
Did you download the video?
No, it didn't work.
Ah, okay.
So yeah, unfortunately, we're not going to see that. We might post it later if I get to it.
Yeah, we'll post it later.
Yeah, if you were going to think of your best possible leader in business, best leader in politics, best leader in military, how would you describe them? What would you say? What would you say about them?
Not well, I mean some sort of physicality, I suppose. So businessman in a pinstripe suit, but like just personality traits, characteristics. Yeah, just some trigger words. So we've got businessman in a pinstriped suit from Rachel. I suppose then you'd expect a vicar to be in a cassock or a collar, maybe not Converse, Jez Hackett.
Rude. Alan saying the best politicians genuinely want to make a difference in society, and they're not just chasing votes.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right, Christine. I think it is more how they behave, what they bring to the role, their qualities and those sorts of things.
Interestingly, though, on this, when we did unconscious bias training for part of the candidates committee, one of the questions was saying that actually people that are most likely to be CEOs in business are over 6 foot.
Oh.
It was something like
That's interesting.
A significant percentage, I'm not going to guess because it'll be wrong, but a significant percentage of CEOs on the FTSE 100 are over 6 foot. And it was significantly higher percentage than there is in normal society.
That's me out then.
Unlucky. But yeah, just so actually we say that's ridiculous to think physically what they might look like, but actually height can be a real thing. It comes with that sense of power and authority, perhaps.
So you've got innovator from Andrew when it comes to business. Yeah, I think that sounds good.
And driven by passion when it comes to politics.
Brilliant. Yeah, Alan, some of the trigger words really are general and quite subjective, so I suppose they could transfer into all the categories, but maybe think specifically about different things and see what you come up with.
It'll be interesting to see whether they are all the same.
Yeah.
Or whether actually there might be things that whether when we think of a leader in church might come across as very different to a business leader.
Yeah, I would hope church and military would be quite different.
Elizabeth saying the best person I ever worked for was approachable, decisive, fair, and tackled the hard issues himself.
Great.
Brilliant. Anne has gone for a businessman in a sharp suit. Politics seems to attract all types. Some scruffy, no idea who you might be thinking of there,
Perfect,
and some
Dan.
smart.
I love it. Perfect.
Interesting. The military leader commands respect. That's a bit on point there, Rachel. It's like church.
Hello.
Some scruffy and some smart. Which one of these?
That was a bit cheeky, wasn't it? Actually, I just say I don't wear Converse. I wear boots to work. Like once I've wore trainers to work, and that one day was awful. The worst day so far because I just couldn't get over the fact when I looked down I had trainers on, even though they were my best trainers. It was too much.
So Ingrid saying motivated, empowers others, and not scared to challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I suppose that sense of not being scared to challenge is quite important in a leader, isn't it? Across all spheres, I think. Carrie again, not about how you look, but how you lead. Fair but firm from Susan. Yeah, I think that's a good one. Oh no, this possibly links in with innovator. Sue saying someone who doesn't lose sight of the big picture but also looks at what is right and wrong, listens but is decisive.
Yeah, brilliant. Interesting one from Christine. Experience in the field would be important.
That's interesting because we're like baby ministers in terms of how long we've been going for.
Yeah.
So
Relative to some.
Don't want to call it out.
Interesting balance in that suggestion there from Christine of experience and the balance of innovator from Andrew. And I'm not saying that those who have been around for a long time can't be innovators, but if you're thinking stereotypes, innovator is probably newer to a role. So I wonder how those two might balance out. These mostly sound like they could apply to all of them, says Rachel. Yeah. We were hoping you might all be a bit more stereotypical and subjective about the individual ones, but
you've all done unconscious bias training.
Tony's got a good one there. A leader should be someone who leads by example.
Brilliant.
And I think we've talked about this before, haven't we? The difference between a leader and a boss.
Yeah.
And how a leader will be at the front of a queue bringing people with them. A boss will be at the back telling them, go on, hurry up, go faster.
Yeah, that's interesting from Matt actually there, about military leaders. So they're harder to explore as they have an authoritative hierarchy, so they have to conform somewhat. Yeah, I think that's interesting because I suppose they can't really shape how they want to be a leader. They're kind of told, they're commanded how to lead, aren't they, I suppose. So
Elizabeth confessing she has done the unconscious bias training. Brilliant. So something we've already kind of hinted at but maybe not quite answered specifically. In what ways are these different types of leader that you're thinking of the same? In what ways are they different, and does it kind of depend on the context and the roles for each of them? So what are the similarities that we've probably answered quite well, I think, in the way we've gone through? But what are maybe some of the differences? And Matt's hinted at one there, which is a good segue, but what other differences do you think there might be? Have you got any suggestions as to what some of the differences might be?
I mean, even within the roles, there's different contexts, isn't there, in which you'd be different in terms of leadership, I think. So when I think about as a minister, there are some times when we feel like we were discussing this literally a couple of days ago, dog collar wearing, and whether we'd go back to wearing a dog collar for work, because as you know, we haven't worn one throughout this. I wear it for assembly in the food bank. Jez, you haven't really worn it apart from for funerals. So I suppose so. Even within our context as a leader in the church, there are times, for example, when we're chairing a meeting, when we feel like we need to wear the dog collar to make the point that there's some sense of authority that comes that we're chairing this meeting. Not necessarily that we're the boss of it, but we're chairing it. And so
we obviously are.
Oh, of course, yeah. Whereas when you go somewhere like on a pastoral visit, maybe you wouldn't wear it, perhaps. Or I suppose if you were visiting in the hospital, you might wear it. If you were visiting in someone's house, you wouldn't. So even within the church leader, it's different, isn't it?
Absolutely.
In terms of leadership, I suppose.
So Susan's saying maybe a church leader would have more compassion than the others.
Of course.
Indeed. Hold that thought for Thursday and we might talk about that a little bit more. Rachel saying that a church leader probably more influenced by prayer, though would be interesting if the other leaders were prayer-led to the same extent.
Absolutely. Now, interestingly, when we did the Walking Through Advent series, we did that session with King Herod and politicians. So Jez spoke to Tim, who's Berry's mayor, and I spoke to Barbara, who's a chairperson of Saddleworth Parish Council, and she is a Christian. She's a practicing Christian, and so actually, when we were doing the interviews, they looked and sounded quite different in terms of she would bring God into her leadership role, and she talked about prayer and those sorts of things, and how kind of her faith life and her spiritual side did influence how she led, and she tried to exemplify compassion and grace and forgiveness and mercy. Whereas Tim was more politician about it. Not in a bad way, but he was more politician, wasn't he?
Just a different way of approaching it, isn't it?
Yeah.
But actually recognising that part of the reason we were able to do that with them was because of the roles that we have. That you're chaplain to the chairperson.
Yeah.
I'm chaplain to the mayor. And that's partly because actually some of their bigger meetings, or the full council meetings, they invite someone to come and lead prayers to start it off with. So there is still at least that kind of vague suggestion of worship and prayer being as part of the leadership, but that's more of a hangover, I think, of Christendom.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, Alan's put a name to what I tried to talk about within our leadership role as a minister, so situational leadership. That's a really Nice.
That's coming from the person trained as a head teacher, so
brilliant. Now, Christine, you make a really valid point, really. Surely each of our views would be reflected by the experience of the various leaders we've encountered along our life journey. And I think that's so true. We've probably all got experiences of a good leader and maybe a not so good leader. And that's, I suppose, what we're going to explore a bit together this evening.
It is indeed. Brilliant. So the next question we've got for you is one that's kind of a little bit more general. But when you think of leaders in church, who is it that you think of? So how would you answer that? Who are the leaders in church? If you want, you can be specific to your own church. Don't talk about names, but talk about perhaps the roles that those people do. Or more generally, who do you think the leaders are in church?
Now, this is an interesting one to see if anyone picks up connectionalism here.
They won't. I'm going to go for not.
I speak to my nan most days. She might be here, she might not be. She's sometimes loitering with intent. She actually pops up and says love you, so I'll know she's here. Now my nan doesn't do church. So when I explain, we speak every night, so after a particularly frustrating meeting I'll be particularly ranty and moany. And quite often she says, well, hang on a second, you're supposed to be the boss. Why do volunteers get to boss you about, tell you what to do? And this is the context, isn't there, where a lot of people think the minister is in charge in the Methodist church, but quite often they're not.
Oh, that it was so.
Yeah, so I've just seen Anne's just put the minister and church council, and that's absolutely right, Anne, the church council is the boss of us. Like, I'm not saying that that's all bad, but in some context,
it means we can blame other people when things go wrong.
Well, you say that, but we're the face of the mistakes to get it in the neck. But sometimes that can be quite a frustrating leadership role when actually you look like you have authority, but you have zero power. And it can be difficult sometimes to lead in that way. I'll be honest, I find it hard sometimes.
So Alan's saying that stewards are given a particular leadership role, but are also individuals with a strong prayer life, definitely.
Yeah, and that's really important.
This was something that changed. I didn't realise this until very recently. In the way the Methodist Church was structured, they used to have 2 meetings that ran the church at local level. They'd have the trustees meeting, and they'd have the stewards meeting. And in theory, the stewards are responsible for the spiritual life of the church, the trustees for the practical material life of the church. And then it was only when everyone was realising that this was a terrible way of doing it that they completely changed everything, and now we have what we have.
Yeah.
But yeah, I didn't know that until very recently.
It's interesting, isn't it? That's something I hear.
Christine saying, if we are true Christians, we should all lead by example in the way we live our lives.
Definitely. Brilliant. Yeah.
Rachel saying that it's the minister, the church leadership team, church council, and sometimes anyone who speaks up.
Absolutely.
Matt being very holy in his answer, saying Jesus should be the leader of the church.
Matt, you need to get used to this now while you're training. It's not Jesus and it's not you.
So Sue saying there are those in official roles, but also those I want to emulate and take as role models, pastoral leaders,
definitely. Yeah.
Brilliant. And then Mum saying a similar thing, leadership team and the minister, but the whole church should be able to be approachable. And Judith being very holy as well, saying that Jesus too is the leader.
That's because Judith's been to some of my church councils, so she'll understand the frustration of a minister.
So she's seen you sat there at the front and just say, oh, Jesus, take the wheel.
Yeah, to the point where sometimes you just want to cry and be like, Jesus, you have it now.
But yeah, I think showing that leadership can come from... It's one of the benefits, I think, of the way church does work, is that it should be able to, in theory, come from anywhere.
Yeah. Oh, that's great, Susan. Thank you for sharing that. So... you go to a joint Methodist and Baptist church, so it's the minister and the church officers, but also emphasising the ministers having a say there. That's really helpful just to get a different perspective, because I know the Anglican church is a bit more hierarchical, isn't it?
From my understanding, yeah.
I mean, the Methodist church claims not to be hierarchical, but...
It still pays the connection officers significantly more than us, but we'll not talk about that today.
Right, next.
Before we get in trouble.
Yeah.
So thinking the same kind of set of questions for going deeper as we've had each time. Do you think the Bible has much to say about leadership? And if you think it does, what kind of things does it say? So does the Bible have much to say about leadership, and what kind of things does it say? And try to think Old and New Testament as well for this, because I think there are a few that will immediately spring to mind. But try and think maybe for some more unusual areas, I think, as well.
And maybe stay away from Paul unless you want to upset me a little bit tonight.
Yeah, no women in leadership, of course.
Don't come at me with that Paul bloke now.
They should remain quiet in church and wear their hats.
Can I go and watch EastEnders then? I'll leave you to it.
Respect our leaders in the Bible. Excellent. Should have flashed it up. There we go, so people can read it too. The more specific you can be as well, I think you'll get maybe some brownie points. So yeah, if you can do chapter and verse, you'll be very well thought of. So Rachel then saying as well about servant leadership, which that's the one that I think always immediately springs to mind for me. Thinking about the concept of Monday, Thursday and servant leadership. Paul gives instructions for bishops and deacons.
You're brave, Alan.
He's talking about the good
I know. I was just going to say, thinking about respecting our leaders and those sorts of things. And we obviously talked about tradition this morning. And I find quite often when we look at leadership in the Bible, we kind of use the Pharisees as people to knock down and to slate, really. So just something of redeeming them this evening, that of course they were leaders, of the temples, and definitely led by tradition. And so even though it's quite easy for us to play Jesus versus the Pharisees when we look at certain verses of scripture, recognising that actually back in the day they would have been good, solid, firm leaders and they were probably very good at leading in many ways, as well as the mistakes they undoubtedly made because they're human.
Absolutely. So Andrew, was it Andrew? Yeah, Andrew saying about leaders must be accountable. And the reason I thought this was because it springs to mind with, I think it's Jesus saying it would be better for a leader to be thrown into a lake with a millstone around their neck than to intentionally mislead people in the ways of faith. And that's a very dramatic way of saying, I think, must be accountable for what they say and do. Alan going to the Old Testament and talking about King David.
Brilliant.
I remember, you may have done it, I know it happened in this circuit just before I came here, of walk through the Old Testament, walk through the New Testament. And it was basically going through the Old and New Testaments in 40 hand signs and words to tell you kind of the big story. And it went through Saul, David and Solomon as kind of the three examples of kings. And Solomon, you would kind of do that action, say no heart for God. And David would be whole heart for God. And Solomon would be half-hearted for God. And three models of leadership there as to what the Old Testament is telling us about what a good leader looks like, I think. No heart, whole heart, half-heart.
Was it David that fancied his mate's wife, so killed him off to sleep with the wife?
Yeah, far from an ideal human being.
I'm just checking we're on the same on the same king.
But the point is that he was then called to repentance for that he didn't just kind of brush it under the carpet, but actually acknowledged his mistake.
Yeah.
Sue saying scary stuff about bad teachers, better to have a millstone around your neck than misleading the young.
Yeah. Christine, Moses. I like looking to Moses as a leader, for someone who leads by example. Yeah, brilliant. And Elizabeth said Moses too.
Moses, yeah, definitely. Yeah, Moses as well, one of those other characters who was undeniably a good leader for God and did some brilliant things, but also quite flawed in many ways as well. We see his anger stopping him being able to get into the promised land. Mum's got a good one there. Jesus leads, but also prepares his followers to lead after.
Yeah, definitely. And I think Ingrid says a bit of that, doesn't she, when she talks about leaders being able to serve others. Welcome, Moira. You're never too late. Tony, brilliant. Favourite verse.
Excellent. So what he has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. As models of leadership go, I think it's
that's not a bad one.
No, definitely.
So I suppose now, do you think the church has much to say about leadership? Do you think we talk about leadership often in the church?
What do you think? Or are we going to have an awkward silence while we see what people say?
I think as soon as someone walks through the door who looks like they might be young enough or free enough to take on a leadership role, whether that be something in church council or local preacher or ordained ministry, if we're able to give them a big shove in that direction, we do, without actually checking their suitability for a leadership role. And that would be my reflection so far as a minister, that sometimes you don't always get the right person in the position of leadership, but actually we're desperate because we're short of people. So there's that kind of feeling of, well, we can't be picky. And my response now, after, my first 2.5 years in ministry, would be that sometimes it's better to have a vacancy than the wrong person in a leadership role.
Absolutely. And I think generally, not completely, but generally, this is where levels above local church do it better.
Yeah.
So at circuit, at district, at connection, because by and large, a lot of those roles, there is kind of almost an official discernment process that you kind of have to go through, things like local preacher, that you have to go through training to be able to lead in that way. And so it kind of gives people an opportunity to work out, is this right for them? And gives other people a chance to think and say, is this right for that person? But actually at local church level, it tends to be much more, we desperately need someone, who can we grab? Who's going to say yes if we ask them? And as you say, it can sometimes be the totally wrong person who might come into it with the best of intentions, or might not. But then cause actually quite a lot of damage in the way that it happens, just because we needed someone rather than
definitely. And I think that's a problem for Methodist churches all over the country, particularly with roles like safeguarding and GDPR, for example. Often the person entering the role isn't best suited, but no one else has come forward, and we're in a position where we have to have someone, which is hard.
Hannah's saying that the church talks about leadership in that it prays more for the leadership of the world and of the country. Interesting. Yeah, I'd not really thought of that, but that's a really good point, I think, of saying that. Alan's saying that the Church of England have a rule that a vacancy has to happen whenever a vicar leaves, called the interregnum. Yeah, that's an opportunity, I think, isn't it? It's supposed to be for the church to kind of reassess their priorities, think about what they want for a vicar coming in. Whereas in the Methodist Church, we panic and get anyone that's left in station and put them into an appointment.
That feels really healthy, actually. Thanks for pointing that out, Alan. We'll suggest that to the Methodist Church. Yeah. We'll have a month off in the summer. And
so then thinking, last one before we read our Bible reading together, do you find that leadership and faith are topics that overlap easily?
What do you think?
I think this is potentially a really challenging one, because I think leadership done right marries up with faith done right, but you can do either of them quite wrong, and it can cause quite a lot of damage. They're things that certainly correlate in the way that they affect things, I would say. What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree.
Excellent, good. Moving on. But what about all of you? What do you think? Does leadership and faith, does it overlap easily? Does it overlap well? I think this again might depend a little bit on what kind of context you're talking about.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's why I just said, I agree, because I'm thinking that on the topic we've just discussed about filling vacancies for leadership roles in church, maybe we don't have enough faith to trust in God's timing and to trust that God's going to put the right person in that role. As you say, we kind of just panic in the Methodist Church and desperately try to fill leadership roles rather than waiting on God's time. And that takes faith.
Absolutely.
And it's something that I'm learning, thanks to the Affirm lot, really, that things happen in God's time and God puts the right people in the right places at the right time. But we just need to trust that.
Yeah, I think Judith's taking that point and saying they can overlap, but it's certainly not easily. And yeah, definitely. I think in the way we talk about it as well as the way we live it out, there's that challenge, isn't there, of you would hope that a good leader would also be in church life, be of good faith, but recognising that sometimes that isn't always the case either. And Christine saying as well, similarly, I think to what you were, if done prayerfully and in God's will, they should overlap.
Yeah. Should we read the Bible?
The Bible.
The Bible.
Indeed.
So tonight we're reading from Mark's Gospel, chapter 10, and we're looking at verses 35 to 45. So it will be on the screen, we'll make it bigger. But if you're following in your Bibles, Mark chapter 10, verses 35 to 45. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." "You don't know what you are asking," Jesus said. Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? We can, they answered. Jesus said to them, You will drink the cup I drink, and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many.
Brilliant. So as with previous 2 weeks, as we've done I think in previous courses as well, when we have a reading, 3 very simple questions, 3 very broad ones. What stands out to you as you heard and as you read that reading? What questions does it raise for you as we went through, and what does it remind you of in either the Bible or elsewhere in life as well? So what stands out for you? What questions does it raise? And what does it remind you of in the Bible or in life? So what did anything stand out to you as you went through it?
Well, I think how easily we could claim that James and John, right?
Yeah.
James and John are kind of desperate for glory, desperate for power, desperate to be seated at the right and the left as they ask Jesus. But I suppose it's recognising that actually throughout this, Jesus has asked his followers kind of, come with me, follow me, give me your lives. And when I read this, I'm trying to almost give them the benefit of the doubt and recognise something of their willingness to follow Jesus right to the end, and their willingness to want to serve him completely. I've no doubt that there was something in them, as there is in all us human beings, that wanted a bit of glory and wanted that position of leadership. But at the same time recognising that, you know, they all thought, didn't they, Jesus was the Messiah coming to overthrow the Roman government. And so, of course, they would have expected people to need to take on leadership roles when Jesus overthrowed and, was seated on the position of power. So why not them?
Yeah.
But at the same time, just recognising their expectations of Jesus, but also their willingness to drink from the cup, to be baptised in the same baptism as him. They're desperate to follow him right to the end.
Brilliant, yeah. So a couple of things that have come through.
Brilliant.
Mum saying the servant and the king need to be equal to serve. Definitely. I think this is something that we can recognise as people of faith who say and mean that everybody is loved and valued by God in the same way, that no one is more worth anything else. And yet in society and in the world, so often we see that actually that isn't true.
Absolutely. So Alan, Jesus probably shocked his followers by turning the concept of leadership upside down.
He had a bit of a nasty habit of that.
He did,
Jesus,
didn't he?
Yeah, everything that you think you understand and think you know.
Yeah.
Just going to turn it on its head and make you think differently.
Yeah.
Tony saying that it reminds him of the song, brother, let me be your servant, let me be as Christ to you.
Yeah, that's the old version. And now it's
brother, sister, let me serve you, let me be as Christ to you.
Got it, yeah.
Not very inclusive, Tony, tut, tut, tut. Rachel saying James and John seem quite bold in asking, or naive, or just wanted to be as close to Jesus as possible.
I'm glad it's not just me that reads something that it's not just there.
There is another version. I don't know whether it's of James and John again, or whether it's another of the disciples. One of the other Gospels has this story with it being their mum that instigates this. I think, basically saying she wanted them to have the place of favour, and so made this conversation happen. I can't remember the specifics. I should have looked it up.
Poor boys.
But in thinking that actually that the way that one's written from memory, it sounds very much more like it is get the glory rather than.
But we haven't got that in front of us tonight. And you can't give me anything that solidifies that. So we're sticking with that.
I will find it.
No, we won't.
So Ingrid talking about the theme of selflessness that runs through it. Definitely.
I love that, Judith. It reminds me of when my mum was a brownie leader. When the brownies shouted, me first, my mum used to say, me first is always last. I love it. I would have liked your mum.
Brilliant. Oh, Matt's getting very technical. The idea of who was best was a typical Greco-Roman cultural debate people would have had at that time, almost like who would be head of the family.
Hello, is someone training for ministry right now?
Potentially. Christine asking, weren't James and John the first
Yeah.
that Jesus asked to follow him? It's just as in lines, first will be last, last will be first. Certainly one of the first.
Yeah.
Simon, Peter and Andrew were the first. And then I think James and John were also fishermen, and very shortly after.
But I like that concept of first will be last, last be first. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Great, thank you. Some
that's
good contributions there.
So thinking then about the theme of some of the leadership questions that we've been thinking about, what do we think leadership looks like to James and John in this reading? So in that kind of place where they're coming up to Jesus and ask him, can we be at your right hand and your left hand? What does leadership then look like to them? I think the first image that pops into my head is kind of the Game of Thrones one, and the phrase "the hand of the king," and thinking about being seated at the right hand and being the one who kind of makes things happen and carries out the will of the one who's in charge. And certainly,
so it's like the church council.
The minister with the secretary and treasurer at the right and left hand. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Rachel just got to sit in the best seats. Absolutely, yeah. I think, as I say, for them, they really were expecting Jesus to overthrow the powers that be. So, of course, they're going to want to jump in there and take their seats, because they've been with him from almost the beginning.
Absolutely.
It's only fair, it's only right.
Ingrid saying that their view of leadership is one that has authority and power or makes them special in some way.
Yeah, something about setting them apart, but obviously the reading did talk about how those seats were prepared for, the people that God's prepared for them. So not necessarily just a case of Jesus handpicking his best mates, but actually God's hand was in this, which I suppose relates back to what we were saying earlier about leadership in the church and having the faith to wait on God's timing and God's people that he calls to take on those roles.
Yeah, absolutely. Sue says, seem to see it as privileged. Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it? Because that's probably a more positive way, I think, of looking at it, seeing it as a privilege, and Mum saying a similar thing of expecting privilege. And rather than seeing it as being after the glory, seeing it as a real privilege to have this chance to lead. And so maybe they're a more positive, a more affirming, friendly reading towards James and John.
Yeah, we'll take it.
So what about the counter side of this? If James and John see it as all of these kind of things as being favoured, as Tony says, what about Jesus? How does Jesus describe leadership in this passage? Is it the same? Is it different? Does he put it in a very different context, or does he say actually, this is kind of the right thing?
Yeah.
Awkward silence.
I'm just waiting on other people now. It's pausing and allowing.
It's a difficult balance, isn't it? Do we want to keep going or?
I mean, to me, it feels like Jesus is saying basically those who want to lead shouldn't be leading. Like, if you want power, then you are not the right person to give it to. It's just a slam down, isn't it?
It is. Absolutely.
No, you followed me for nothing if that's what you thought you were getting.
Definitely. And it's quite often the way, isn't it, as well? We often think of actually the people that really, really want something. That if you really, really want something, you've got to really prove that you want it for the right reasons. And often we see that actually the people that are sometimes best suited to certain roles are the ones that would actually say, I want nothing to do with this.
Yeah.
And that makes them better at it, recognising that they need to come at it with some level of humility or
yeah. Which is a prompt to the couple of people here who have been, called and pushed in the direction of local preachers training, but haven't yet taken up that cross. This is a call to you. See me looking directly into the camera.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
If you don't want it, you're called.
And the two of you know exactly who you are, because we've had that conversation many times.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, Rachel, Jesus makes it sound less fun than I think they're picturing. Yeah, it's a dose of reality here, isn't it, for them? Actually, it's not going to be all sitting on thrones and eating cheese, There's a seriousness about leadership.
Indeed.
Why not cheese?
Indeed, fair enough. Ingrid saying, putting others first, equality and humble humility, absolutely.
Yeah.
And a few people have said about Jesus saying leadership is serving others. I think what really strikes me is what Jesus is saying about leadership is actually just how difficult and painful it can be.
Yeah.
that recognise that actually, in some ways, being the leader, you're very much out there on your own at times, and things go wrong, and it will be laid at your door, and that can be a really difficult place to be. I know there have been times in ministry, I think for both of us, in very different ways at times, but there have been some really difficult things that we've had to deal with that we probably would much rather have gone, actually, I'm just going to brush this under the carpet, pretend it's not happening and carry on. But actually having to step up and do that form of leadership has meant having some really difficult conversations and actually taking quite a lot of flack from certain people.
Definitely, yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. So verse 45, as that key verse, I think, for many of us, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. So do you think servanthood and leadership go hand in hand naturally? And is this a good model of leadership? That is my question. So do you think servanthood and leadership go hand in hand naturally? And is this a good model of leadership?
Very interesting two-part question there, I think. I think my answers to A and B would be quite different.
Okay.
Well, I'm not going to say any more than that.
Okay.
I'm going to wait to see what comes up in the comments.
Someone says.
Yeah, absolutely. Alan, just going back to the last question, Jesus is also saying that leadership is putting yourself in the front line. Definitely.
Absolutely.
And again, that comes to that difference between leader and boss, doesn't it? Of being out of the front, calling people forward, or being at the back and pushing everyone else out there to say, go on, you do it, you deal with this. Yeah. So then the question at the moment, do you think servanthood and leadership go hand in hand naturally? And is it a good model of leadership? What do you reckon?
Well, I find the second part of this question difficult, I think. So this sense of servanthood can make us vulnerable and make people potentially think we're weaker than we are. And therefore, as a model of leadership, sometimes it can be problematic when people mistake your servant heart for
doormat,
being a doormat, being gullible, being, open to manipulation and those sorts of things. And that's when I think it becomes a difficult model of leadership. But I'm not saying it's not worth the challenge and the struggle, because it is, I suppose, Yeah,
you see, I was thinking about the second part, that I think, yes, it definitely is a really good model of leadership. A model that we're always maybe trying to reach but never quite get right. Because actually the people that you lead, you have to have some kind of compassion and empathy for, because
absolutely.
you need to understand what it is they're coming from. But do you think it goes hand in hand naturally? And I think definitely not. I think when you put someone in a position of power and authority or influence in any sphere of life, it can be very hard to keep that level of humility and not let it go to your head in some way. Right, Andrew's saying that some people just want to be led in the normal way, and I think that's definitely true. And then the follow-up point, that some people find it hard to be served by anyone, let alone their leaders. But then that's what makes people sit up and take notice. So talking about then that witnessing element about doing things differently. Mum making a similar point to what I was trying to say about it should go hand in hand, but it's not natural. It's something that has to be worked on. And is a constant partnership.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think Matt's point is a good one about that pull between what we often think of as a good leader needing to be confident and assured of the direction to go, but also sensitive enough to listen and learn from others. And I think that's a really good way of modelling that tension. If you want a leader who will say, here's a great idea, let's run with this and let's do this. But also not, as you say, just running over everyone else and saying, you're coming with me whether you like it or not.
Well, it's part of that ability to enable others, isn't it? To not just have you leading and giving them all the thoughts, giving them all the direction, but enabling them to see something in themselves that can also think for themselves and explore options and kind of prayerfully discern the future for things, rather than just telling them this is going to happen. Actually enabling and journeying alongside is so important, isn't it, for leadership?
Definitely. And I remember a really good Bible study from, I think it was Spring Harvest, that was talking about some of this question. I think it was in relation to Moses, and saying actually the two most important words that a leader can say is yes. No, 3 words, sorry. yes, thank you, and sorry. So recognising actually when you make mistakes, even though you're the leader, being willing to be humble enough to say, actually, I got that wrong and I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
Saying thank you, recognising the great work that so many other people will be doing to enable you to do what you're doing. But also saying yes, that when people come with ideas and inspiration and saying, actually, could we go and try this? Being willing to say yes and letting them run with it.
That's an interesting comment from Anne there, looking at different contexts. So having worked for both American/Canadian and British managers, the British ones would never take on a servant role, whereas the American/Canadians had no problem with serving roles. That's really interesting. Thank you.
I wonder if that's got anything to do with a colonial heritage from a certain island nation.
Gosh. And then Rachel, a leader should be seeking the best for whoever they're leading, which is in itself a way to serve them and therefore inseparable. But interesting to see how it works out in practice. Absolutely. So just skipping down to the third question there, just we're at time. What does the phrase "lord it under" rather than "lord it over" mean to you? Do you find that a helpful phrase? So obviously Jesus talked about not lording it over and those sorts of things. So lord it under rather than lord it over, and how that speaks into our thinking around leadership. This was a phrase actually that Martin Luther King himself enjoyed using.
I was going to ask where it had come from, because I don't think I've ever heard this before.
Martin Luther King enjoyed using it, obviously Martin Luther King Jr., and would often ask people, what have you done for others? So rather than what have you done for yourself, what have you done for others? So lord it under rather than lord it over.
So changing the Miranda song.
Yeah. What have you done today to make other people feel good? Yeah.
Brilliant. Oh, it's a very interesting phrase. It's another one that I think will make, even if you don't like it, will make you think, because it's different to the normal way that you heard. And in the same way, was it Rachel was talking about the idea of witness? There we go. Yeah. In the same way, talking about that being what makes people sit up and take notice. I think this phrase can perhaps work in a similar way. Of even if you don't quite get on with it or don't quite like what it says, it still makes you think.
Yeah.
Which is always good, being challenged and made to think.
Just a bit.
By things that might be different from what you like. But any thoughts about that idea of lord it under or lord it over in the comments before we move on? Maybe there are. Maybe everybody just loves it.
Maybe everyone loves it. Or doesn't.
Or doesn't, and won't say, indeed. So in verse 41, I think it is, we see the result of this kind of quest for power and glory. And it's an argument that forms then between the disciples. So this is kind of where the kind of the leadership and the oppression side of things come together, because we've been focused a lot on leadership, but this is kind of thinking about where the oppression side can fit into it, and recognising the negative side of leadership done wrong and what that can lead to. So the first question here: how does one person or group of people seeking power impact on others who are maybe not a part of this group? And then can you think of any examples of that? So how does one person or group seeking power impact on others who are not part of that group? And can you think of any examples of this?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So I'm again thinking about our church contexts and how at times when there's a particular issue or a particular desire that someone has, there can be that temptation to go around the group of people before a meeting and try and get them on your side. And really there's something about that in what we see in the Bible passage tonight. You know, you've got James and John going off to Jesus really quickly, getting in there before the other lads to say, look, pick me. And the one thing that you're told when you arrive in an appointment, be really cautious of the people who are very, very keen to meet you before you start work, especially if they start talking about work, because they might have a hidden agenda there that they want you on side for something that they really want to happen in the church.
Definitely. And that's not to say that they do, because I know some of you have been amazing in the way that you've greeted us when we've started. But it's something that goes as a warning, doesn't it, of saying that there is this recognition that sometimes people will want the minister on their side, because it does come with a bit of
perks of the power. Job. Yeah,
indeed.
Yeah.
So Christine's saying that my belief is a good leader will take the team with them rather than expecting them to follow.
Absolutely.
And Rachel saying, the worst case, those seeking power would only see others as potential supporters, not as people with their own needs. And Ingrid recognising that the other group who aren't part of that will be isolated, as seen as not good enough, disengaged and bullied.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I think one of the classic examples of that is recognising that kind of that quote that comes around every so often. When they came for the ... I didn't speak up because I wasn't one of them.
Yeah.
And thinking, actually, this is kind of almost a slightly different way of looking at that, and saying that those in power might seek it for those who look like them, but not for others. But as long as it's not us, we're okay with that.
I think Matt raises a really important... I think this is really important. Could it also be having the wisdom to let people go who refuse to move on the journey? I think this is such an important challenge for the church, actually, particularly when we look at some of the conversations that we're currently having as a whole big church, and the difficulty of trying to kind of cling on to people that we have in our churches and keep them really happy and wanting to stay, but also wanting to take new steps in faith out into the world to potentially, tell other people about the good news and have their lives transformed by God's grace and God's love. And what happens when the two don't marry up necessarily? What happens when your leadership and your heart for new Christians, for discipling, for evangelism and mission doesn't quite tie up with the church congregation? And just even on smaller issues, really, what happens like when it's time to potentially either upset people or move forward? And this can be hard, particularly in churches where you've got a couple of really vocal people who are so unhappy with the ideas of moving forward. But you kind of, do you leave them behind? Do you put their nose out of joint? And do you take them up on their threats to leave? Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, it's the image that I've always pulled on whenever I've kind of thought about this is that Jesus is looking for the lost sheep, leaving the 99 to go for that one. And often I think for us at the moment, actually the question is leaving the one to go for the 99. But that's a separate issue. But that challenge, actually Jesus was willing to step out and upset those who were in as part of the flock in order to go and reach those who maybe weren't. Elizabeth using a good example. It doesn't need to be church examples necessarily at all, but talking of Greta Thunberg, I think I would spell it incorrectly as well, Elizabeth, so don't need to worry about that. But being a good example of someone who did step out on their own and who got a really good following, but also, I think you can see, got an awful lot of hate for the way that she was, often from those male, pale and stale people who have got all the power at the moment and didn't want to leave it up, and so attacked this teenage girl as a way of trying to keep hold of that.
Yeah, definitely. Carrie, I think, making a good point there.
It can be very easy to feel excluded when a group starts taking action on their behalf. Leadership should always consult and not assume. Yeah, brilliant. So potentially a little bit controversial this time, which I'm sure nobody will expect for us. But think back to watching a recent election campaign, or perhaps even the presidential campaign, not so long ago. Did the candidates present themselves as good leaders? And if so, how? And if not, why not?
If so, how so? If not, sorry, I don't know what I was writing there. I think, do you know the worst it is? I saw you'd corrected it for me first time, and I've gone back and added it back in. If so, how so?
If so, how so?
If not, why not?
And if not, why not?
I literally, you've corrected that, and I've gone back and redone it.
Hopefully, though, you understand the point of if so, how, and if not, why not. So what do you think? Did the recent election campaign, or perhaps the presidential campaign, model the candidates as good leaders?
Now, when I wrote this question, in the back of my mind, I had the British press, okay? And the American press for that matter, but any press actually, and how media can really stir up and really cause a lot of issues when it comes to things like campaigns and I mean, we've seen it today, let's be honest, in the newspapers between the royal family and Harry and Meghan, and we've seen just what a stir the press can cause in this, and seen how candidates don't always present themselves well or kind of as good leaders, because we see what goes to print, and we see the way that they speak to one another and they treat each other, and the way they're in the media constantly going at each other, and you think, really? You're going to lead the country? Really? You know?
And for me, the classic example is Prime Minister's questions.
Gosh.
Not just Boris Johnson, but especially Boris Johnson. But it's happened every time I've seen it, no matter who's been it, either Dispatch Box
or even Question Time now. Actually, we've stopped watching Question Time because of it.
Seeing that it's never a case of here's a question, here's an answer. Even if you don't like the answer, this is the answer. It's always, well, wouldn't it be so much worse if that person was doing this? It's so infuriating.
Yeah, you know what? I might have done that, but 20 years ago you did this so hard.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, really?
And I think Alan raises a good example as well of Biden and Trump in that first, the first debate in particular they had. As much as I love Joe Biden stood on TV saying to Donald Trump, "Oh, will you shut up, man?" As much as I love
it wasn't
that,
all right,
it wasn't really
a
good demonstration of what you would look for. And I think Andrew is saying exactly that. The candidates.
Oh, is that what A means, Andrew?
That's what I'm assuming it means.
Okay.
That candidates tend to criticise each other rather than provide honest answers. True, and not that it's a not one that they're not true leaders voicing their own opinions. They're just looking out for number one or their party and not the majority of people. This is something that I found really challenging when Jeremy Corbyn was Labour leader, because for so long before that, when I would be praying, I would use lines like we pray
for the many,
not the few. And then Jeremy Corbyn instituted that as his kind of slogan. And I felt all of a sudden, actually, I can't use that in my prayers now because it sounds like a party political statement, which it never was, but then it became one. Anyway, so that's a side issue.
And no, you're right, Christine. It doesn't inspire confidence at all, actually.
No,
and it's really poor behaviour. And you think, how can you lead a country to, a place of harmony and compassion and love and grace when actually you've caused so much division that we'll be cleaning up this mess for the next 5 years you're in power, you know?
Absolutely. So maybe skipping this next question and going to the one after. Do you think that this just happens in politics?
Yeah.
Or can you think of examples where it happens in other areas of life as well? So does it just happen in politics? Or can you think of examples in other areas of life as well? Did you write that question with anything particular in mind?
In what way? What do you think?
Any particular examples that you might have had?
No. Well, yes, but no.
Yes, but no. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think politics is the place where you first go to. This is a really obvious example of this, but recognising actually, I think probably we all do it in different ways at times.
We absolutely do. Like that desire to get someone on side with you in an argument, or when some friction's going on between families and friends and churches even. You kind of go in and having conversations behind the backs and trying to, I don't want to say manipulate people onto your side, but I don't really know what else to call it actually when you're having those sorts of conversations where you are slating another person intentionally to get someone to take your side. That, it is a bit manipulative.
And how many times have you fallen out with someone and as soon as, maybe you've had an argument over the phone, as soon as you put the phone down, you've then immediately dialed someone else, so you can be the first to tell them your account.
You're taking a dig at me there, you are,
I'm
right?
I'm not at all. Not at all.
I do call my nan often and say, latest drama, grandmother,
Not at all. If you have a feeling of guilt about that, that's between you and God, not me.
I don't have any guilt.
But no, I think it was to say that we all do it. We all have an argument with someone and immediately I need to go and tell such and such my version of this because otherwise they'll hear it from them and then it'll be worse.
And then they'll think I'm the bad person. I'm not really. It wasn't my fault drama kicked off. Skip that one.
Skip that question. So we've got a few statistics and it might seem like they're kind of out of nowhere, but it will become obvious hopefully as to where they're coming from. So looking at a few different statistics about how different groups of people might be might struggle in society for different reasons. So the first one, women are 47% more likely to suffer severe car crash injuries. And before anyone says anything, this is not a comment on women drivers, but it's actually recognising...
I'd say only one of us has totaled a car.
It was not total. I blame the insurance company. But this is saying that actually the issue here is that safety mechanisms within cars are designed for men, not for women. And so they're more likely to suffer injuries as a result of a crash than men are because it's simply not designed for them. And also then looking at the kind of popular media and films, that for every female film character, you will see 2.24 male film characters. So there's a massive domination of men in Hollywood.
And then obviously we've got issues like the gender pay gap. In the UK, that's 15.5%. That's insane. Are you being paid 15.5% more than me, Jez, in your stipend?
I wish.
I say, if so, where's it gone? 8.2 million people in the UK feel they've been discriminated against because of their gender.
And that's over 1 in 10 people, which is ridiculous.
This feels really important to talk about on International Women's Day, doesn't it, actually?
As Mum's just said in the comments, yeah, absolutely. But it's not even just gender, though, is it? It's race as well. And thinking about some of the statistics and things that talk about some of the issues of race in society, 100 in 1,000 black people have been stopped and searched by the police, 1 in 10, which is how you would normally write that, but I've written it that way because then you can more easily compare it to the number for white people, which is only 4 in 1,000. 25 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police, which is just shocking. And then thinking about home ownership, that for black Caribbean people, it's about half of the percentage for black Caribbean people that own their own home as it is for white British people. And the percentage of black Caribbean people in social housing is 3 times higher than for white British people.
Unemployment rates are 10% for black people, 7% for Asian people, and then 4% for white people. 71% of ethnic minority groups have experienced racism since Brexit, which is up from 58%. And I think I read somewhere the other day, actually, that racism against Asian people is right up since the start of the COVID pandemic. It's tripled or something due to the whole situation with it having started in Wuhan and those sorts of things.
And I think that shocking statistic about Brexit is shocking in 2 levels. Firstly, that it's gone up after Brexit to 71%, but actually also that it was 58% in the first place, which is just shocking. So we're using those to think about that sense of when you get people in leadership, there can be that temptation to look at people who are the same as them. That actually people who think like me, who act like me, who agree with me, are the ones that I want to have in power with me. And so there are many people in our society and around the world who are oppressed and abused simply because they are not the same as those in power. So as we mentioned earlier, a majority of people in leadership are actually male. And in this country and across the Western world, they're also white and generally older in demographic as well. And so when we read those statistics about women and about people of different races and ethnic minorities, actually a lot of the reason that those things exist is simply because the people in power are different and don't hear their stories, don't care about their stories, and think, well, actually, how can I look after the people that are like me? Because that's the experience I know. And it might be an intentional thing that they do, but actually it can also be something that happens unintentionally. If you haven't got the experience of someone from a different background, you simply don't think of it.
That's interesting, isn't it?
But thinking about some of those challenges, can you think of any present day examples of this kind of thing?
Can you?
I can, but I wrote the question. So I'm going to leave it and see if anything comes up in the comments as well.
So Anne's just talking about the gender pay gap at an American firm she worked for. The first management dinner to which women were invited, Anne was one of only 6 women to 250 men. Goodness me.
I think I read as well, when I was looking under the CEO's statistic, not only are the majority over 6 foot, but I think 7 of the CEOs in the FTSE 100 are women. 93% male, which again is showing that massive divide. And I think in the House of Commons as well, there is a minority of women. It's higher than it was, and that was massively celebrated, if you remember, at the last Parliament. But actually recognising it's still nowhere near 50%, and that doesn't seem to be recognised as a challenge, or as something to be celebrated.
Yeah, but recognising the need for representation, because I remember when I was doing government and politics at A-level, and the comment was made that, well, if women don't put themselves forward, how can they expect to be elected as our representatives? But just recognising how important it is to have people represented in those public spheres, because it will actually encourage other people to stand up and say, you know, yeah, I want to sit at that table. I want to be that, and I can dream of one day being a politician if that's what a little girl wants to be, you know, and the importance of representation. I find it interesting, particularly, you know, lately about when you have conversations with churches about the LGBTQIA plus conversation and same-sex marriage, and often it's said, well, yeah, do you know, I'm okay with them being gay, but why have we got to have gay people in our TV programmes? Why have I got to see them snogging all over the TV as I'm watching EastEnders and eating my tea, you know? And I mean, I'd say that about anyone snogging on the TV, because every time I watch something, there's always something in it, and Jez is like, oh great, you've chosen something like that again. but actually just recognising the importance of having LGBTQIA plus people, Black and Asian people, women in our TV programmes in these different positions and roles for the sake of representation, and to encourage younger generations that actually, you know what, you can be gay, lesbian, queer and an actress. You can, you know, be represented in these things. This is all right, you know.
And it's in positions of power as well. Obviously, in the last 24 hours, we've seen the huge issues that have been raised around Meghan Markle and the way she was treated by the press and by the royal family because she was black. And I think we've seen it as well in the way people in power are treated, so the way MPs are treated. You see people like Diane Abbott being treated horrifically, again, because she's not only black but also has the audacity to be a woman. And so it gets treated doubly badly.
It's interesting how scared the women is of strong, powerful women who stand up and won't take oppression and stand up and say, okay, actually, you can't treat me like that. And it seems to me that the world's terrified of women who have the audacity to stand up and say, that's not good enough.
And often it's because it's different and challenging, isn't it? We're used to a straight, white, middle-class men that are in charge of things, and we know what that looks like. And so when we see someone else that doesn't fit those things, it's scary because it might be different.
Yeah. Great. Alan's comment about football. Brilliant.
Give Racing the Red Card campaign is 25 years old. And I think some of the grief you've seen about that's been given to players simply for taking the knee before games has been, again, shocking. Matt asking about the demographics of Methodist ministers. I think, I don't have them if there are statistics, but I don't have them in front of me. But I think from memory, ministers and superintendents, it's pretty good the way
it's a good
it's
spread,
pretty good represented,
yeah.
And also ethnicity-wise, I think it's pretty good. The challenge then comes when you move up to the level of district chair. And I think there are about 30 districts, something like that, in Methodism. So. And I think I think they might have just hit double figures for women in district chairs, which isn't really enough when you look at it that way.
Yeah. So we got. Yeah, Judith making an important point of the role of women having changed over the years. You know, and there's nothing wrong with being a stay-at-home mum. A housewife, there's nothing wrong with all those things, and that ought to be celebrated just as much as women who are actresses, lawyers, judges, all these different things. Yeah, I found it interesting the other day. I don't know if many of you keep up with the Kardashians, probably not. I'm on Instagram, so but one of the Kardashian sisters, actually, I think it might have been Khloe, possibly. She'd done a bikini model shoot for a range that she'd just released. And she'd obviously put pictures of this bikini shoot on Instagram, celebrating the fact that she's just released her own bikini range. Amazing, you know. And someone had taken that and cropped it next to a picture of a young black woman who had gone on some sort of space program or something along those lines, and put them side by side. And why are we celebrating a woman in a bikini covered in makeup with a boob job, instead of a young woman, intelligent, smart, going to NASA, you know? And I said to Jez, actually, it infuriates me that in order to celebrate a young black woman interested in space and those sorts of things, we have to slate the woman who's going interested in clothing, makeup, fashion, those sorts of things. Why are they, you know, why are they mutually exclusive? Why have we got to put one down in order to raise up another?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think on International Women's Day as well is so important, isn't it? Women don't need to put other women down in order to celebrate other people. That's not okay.
No. And the whole point of that post was you can raise questions about what society values and
you can
and all those kind of things, but actually there are ways of doing it that don't pick out individual people
women, absolutely,
and slag them off for actually what they're doing. But it's about asking those questions about society more broadly, I think. I think that the last question that we're gonna offer today is just a twofold one. Firstly, how should the church respond to the challenges of racism, sexism, and all types of oppression in society? But also then, following on from that, maybe how does the church need to change in order to respond that way? Rachel raising some good points. Those are the ones that I was thinking of.
Yeah, absolutely.
About Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, but also Uyghur Muslims in China.
In China, yeah.
And the way that groups like that are treated because they're different from those in power.
Absolutely.
And obviously there's the classic, isn't there, of the Holocaust. And how Jewish people, amongst many others, were murdered because they were different and used as scapegoats. So then this last one to think about then, how should the church respond to oppression of all kinds, and how might the church need to change in order to respond?
And I think, personally, I would say we had the answer to this one earlier, and that is Tony's comment for me. This is the answer as to how we should be responding to these types of things. Tony quoted earlier from Micah 6 verse 8, "And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." I think if we're taking the challenge of acting justly and loving mercy and walking humbly, all of these things will come as a result. We will call out these things in order for people to flourish as beloved children of God.
And I think just to not disagree, not by any means. It's a brilliant verse to live by. But maybe just to offer a slightly different way of looking at it as well, about what loving mercy and acting justly might look like. Is thinking about the lectionary reading for the Sunday just gone, and how that is Jesus turning the tables in the temple, and recognising that sometimes those places of power and authority need to be really shaken and challenged. And actually the church should be a group of people who really do that, who recognise actually the value in every single human being, the image of God in every single human being. And so is wanting and willing to stand up and put itself on the line, as Jesus did, risk going to the cross for others who need our help. But then I think the second part of that question is recognising that actually the church has so often been complicit in these things and has got many things wrong and made many mistakes. And so actually needing to come first of all from a place of repentance and being willing to acknowledge that the church is by no means perfect and has much work to do itself. But that maybe is being part of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciated you praying this morning actually for the church and the way the church has behaved towards women.
Well, yeah, I mean, women is just one example of how bad the church can be at times. And I think actually it's one of the ways in which I'm really proud of the Methodist Church at the moment. I think it gets a lot of things wrong, obviously. But the way in which it's trying to get back to its roots, I think, of being a real champion for justice. And it's talking about sexism, it's talking about racism, it's talking about homophobia. And it's saying actually one of the first and foremost things we want to do is be an inclusive church in its broadest possible sense. And say that actually we are going to do our best to counteract racism at all levels of the church, sexism at all levels of the church. But it started by recognising it's made some serious mistakes, and quite recent mistakes as well. We're not pretending that this is all in the past in history, but actually saying that the first thing we need to do is to change ourselves, and then we can have a better voice of witness calling out what we see around us. I'm getting a bit preachy.
Matt's just said the church finding its own voice in challenging these issues. Yeah, being progressive and radical about it is just so important. And then Carrie too, talking about an inclusive church open to all. Brilliant. So we've got some homework for you as usual.
As always, you would expect nothing less, I'm sure.
Of course.
So a few questions to take away and consider, I think. So what opportunities do you have to show leadership in your life? And that might be a work role, it might be a church role, it might be a family role, it might be any kind of thing. But there'll be something that you can show leadership in your life. And when you do so, how can you model the servant leadership that Christ demonstrates and that we've spent a lot of tonight talking about? And then finally to think about how can you encourage others to see the ways in which they can lead others as well. And as we've talked about as well, leaders come from everywhere in the life of the church. So how can we be better at maybe equipping those who might be less traditionally seen as leaders? And particularly thinking about some of those challenges of representation and saying actually people who don't look like all the rest of the leadership team, who don't think like all the rest of them,
standing
who maybe act
back,
differently.
isn't it? Yeah, standing back for them to come forward, really. And then read and research stories of those from a different background to you to understand different experiences.
I think that's a really big one, and one that I've learned over the last few years. And when we first went to Queen's, we had a module on Black and Asian theology. And before the start of the first lecture, we were given a couple of chapters by different authors to read and to reflect on, and then bring our thoughts to the first lecture. And I remember reading a chapter by James Cone, and sitting there in the lecture and saying, well, I get what he's saying, but he just sounds so angry, and that's just going to wind people up and annoy people, and it's not going to help, and it's not going to fix it. Why can't he do it more rationally? Why can't he explain things better? And then as we went on through the course, listening to some of the stories and understanding what was behind that, and thinking actually he was really bloody calm in that chapter. He deserved to flip his lid an awful lot more. And I think again we saw it in America and in this country with the response to Black Lives Matter. Yes, they should be allowed to protest, they should be allowed to have their voice, but not like that, not like that, not like that, not like that. They shouldn't in any way be angry about centuries of injustice and oppression. And I think it's only when we understand the stories of how people have got to where they are that we really understand them, why people might be angry about certain things.
And then finally, just that constant challenge really of how can you stand up for those who face oppression because of who they are. And this is just an ongoing challenge for us as church, as Christian people. How can we stand up for those around us?
Brilliant.
So yeah, homework for the week. If you want anything more specific in terms of reading, maybe some books you might want to read, let us know and we can point you in the right direction of those sorts of things.
Indeed.
Or even borrow you some that we have, because we have some ranty books. So
many ranty books. You may have noticed now and again we love a good rant.
So one way in which we can serve the world is to pray for the world. So we've written a prayer this week. Jez has grammar checked it. You'll be pleased to know.
Very briefly, so there may still be some bits that I've missed.
So let's just say out loud where you are in your homes. We'll pray this out loud together. So let's pray.
Creator God, you created all people in your own image, precious and wonderful in your sight. We confess today that we have not always seen the beauty of your image in others, that there are times when we have knowingly or unknowingly judged and excluded others for their gender, race, sexuality, politics, and so much more. God, as we come with sorry hearts to receive your forgiveness, we pray that you will transform us into people who are dedicated to servanthood, to walking with the oppressed, to stand with the excluded, to use our voice to speak for the silenced, to cross boundaries and barriers and stand alongside the other. We hear an almost silent whisper, breathed by the Spirit of wisdom and beauty, that we are all your beloved, fearfully made children of God. Amen.